Oliver Sloane had always prided himself on his independence. As a master restorer of antiques and historical objects, his life revolved around preserving the past and bringing stories back to life. His property was a reflection of his passionate, charming, sprawling piece of land on the edge of town, where he could work on projects in peace. The centerpiece of the property was an old barn he had painstakingly transported from another state years ago. The structure, a masterpiece of 19th-century craftsmanship, was more than just a workspace. It was a treasure chest of tools, rare antiques, and family memories. For Oliver, this barn was the embodiment of everything he valued: history, hard work, and legacy. The barn's importance to him went far beyond its practical uses. It had been a labor of love to restore it to its former glory. He had spent months poring over architectural blueprints and sourcing original materials to rebuild it piece by piece. Every beam and plank had been treated with care, every nail hammered with a sense of purpose. It was here that he kept his rarest finds, tools that once belonged to craftsmen long gone, heirlooms he had acquired through careful negotiation, and records of his work meticulously cataloged in weathered notebooks. Sometimes he would step inside and feel as if he had been transported back in time. It was his sanctuary, his refuge from the chaos of the outside world. That morning, however, as Oliver stepped outside with his coffee in hand, something felt off. The air was still, heavy with an eerie silence. He walked across the yard, heading toward the barn to retrieve a set of tools for a restoration project he had started the week before. But as he approached the spot where the barn stood, his steps faltered. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. The barn was gone. For a moment, Oliver thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He blinked, stared, and blinked again. But the truth refused to shift. The barn, his barn, with all its treasures, had completely vanished. In its place was a flat patch of dirt, recently disturbed, with no sign of the structure that had stood there for years. He dropped his coffee mug, which shattered on the ground, but he didn't care. His mind raced as he scanned the area, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened. There was no debris, no sign of a storm, no evidence of a fire or collapse. It was as if the barn had been plucked from the earth and carried away by some invisible force. As the initial shock wore off, a cold anger began to rise in his chest. He rushed back inside to grab his phone, determined to call the police, but stopped when he noticed something taped to his front door. It was an official-looking envelope, stamped with the logo of the local homeowners association. Oliver frowned. He had always kept the HOA at arm's length. His property was technically within the association's jurisdiction, but he had never signed any agreements or paid their dues. His land was private, and he had made it clear to the HOA that he didn't intend to participate in their rules or governance. Tearing open the envelope, Oliver's frustration grew as he read the neatly typed letter inside. The document stated that his barn had been classified as an abandoned and unsafe structure and had been removed in accordance with the HOA's guidelines for community improvement. The letter went on to say that the materials had been auctioned off to cover the cost of removal, and that the decision was final. If he had any objections, he was instructed to file a formal complaint through their online portal. Oliver's hand shook as he crumpled the letter in his fist. Unsafe structure. Auctioned off. None of it made any sense. He had spent countless hours maintaining that barn, ensuring it was as solid as the day it was first built. It was far from abandoned, it was the heart of his property. And how could the HOA have any jurisdiction over his land when he wasn't even a member? The questions piled up in his mind, each one more infuriating than the last. Someone had to be behind this, and Oliver was determined to find out who. He stormed back outside, pacing the yard as his mind reeled. His first instinct was to call the HOA office and demand an explanation, but he knew from experience that he would be met with stonewalling and bureaucratic excuses. The HOA had always been a thorn in his side. Over the years, they had sent him countless notices complaining about the state of his yard, the height of his fence, and even the color of his mailbox. He had ignored every single one, confident in his right to manage his property as he saw fit. This, however, was different. This wasn't a petty fine or a veiled threat, this was theft, plain and simple. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Oliver decided he needed to approach this methodically. He walked to the empty patch of dirt where the barn had stood and crouched down, running his fingers through the soil. It had been smoothed over, but he could see faint impressions in the dirt where heavy machinery had been used. Tire tracks led away from the site, disappearing into the woods at the edge of his property. He took out his phone and snapped pictures of everything: the tracks, the disturbed earth, even the shadows of where the barn's foundation had once been. This was evidence, and he intended to use it. His next move was to call a neighbor, a retired mechanic named Henry, who had lived in the area for decades and had a knack for noticing things others didn't. When Henry answered the phone, Oliver quickly explained the situation, and Henry promised to come over. Within minutes, the older man arrived, his face etched with concern. Together, they examined the tracks and tried to piece together what might have happened. Henry pointed out that the machinery used would have to be industrial grade, far too large to be operated without drawing attention. Someone had gone to great lengths to make this look like an official operation. As the day wore on, Oliver's frustration turned into determination. Whoever had taken his barn had underestimated him. He wasn't the type to roll over and accept injustice. This was his property, his life's work, and he wasn't about to let it be stolen out from under him. He didn't know how far he would have to go, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to stop until he got his barn back. Oliver spent most of the night pacing his living room, running through every possible explanation for what had happened. The barn didn't just disappear into thin air. Someone had to have planned this, coordinated it, and executed it with precision. But who? And why? The letter from the HOA kept replaying in his mind, the carefully worded justification for what they had done, or claimed to have done, reading like an insult. The notion that his property had been labeled unsafe was absurd. Every inch of that barn had been inspected, repaired, and maintained by his own hands. And the suggestion that it had been abandoned was nothing short of laughable. He had spent more time in that barn than inside his own house. By the time dawn broke, Oliver had decided on his first course of action. He would confront the HOA directly. If they had the gall to send that letter, then they should have no problem answering his questions. He doubted they would be forthcoming, but he was done waiting for answers to magically fall into his lap. Throwing on a jacket, he grabbed his phone and the crumpled letter, then headed to his truck. The HOA office was located in a bland strip mall on the edge of town. The building was as unremarkable as the organization itself, with a small sign out front that read Crestwood Community Management. Oliver had avoided this place like the plague for years, refusing to let the HOA encroach on his independence. But now, standing in front of the glass doors, he felt a simmering rage bubbling just below the surface. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The receptionist behind the desk didn't look up immediately. She was busy typing something on her computer, her nails clacking loudly against the keyboard. "Can I help you?" she asked without making eye contact. "Yes," Oliver said, his voice sharp. He placed the letter on the counter between them. "I need to speak to someone about this." The receptionist glanced at the letter, her expression neutral, then finally looked up at him. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Oliver said flatly. "But I think I deserve an explanation for why my barn was stolen off my property in the middle of the night." Her demeanor didn't waver. "We don't handle walk-ins without an appointment. If you'd like, I can schedule something for next week." "Next week?" Oliver's voice rose. "My barn was taken yesterday. I'm not waiting a week to figure out what's going on." The receptionist gave him a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, I can't help you unless you follow the proper procedures. You're welcome to file a formal complaint online." Oliver clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not here to file a complaint. I'm here to find out who authorized this, and I'm not leaving until I get some answers." The receptionist sighed, clearly irritated, and picked up the phone. "One moment." She dialed a number and spoke quietly into the receiver, glancing at Oliver occasionally. After a brief exchange, she hung up and pointed to a door at the far end of the office. "Mr. Carlyle will see you." Oliver didn't thank her. He walked toward the door, his boots echoing loudly against the tile floor. When he stepped inside, he found himself in a small, sterile conference room. Sitting at the head of the table was Richard Carlyle, the HOA president. Oliver recognized him from the few newsletters he had bothered to glance at over the years, a man in his late 50s with slicked back hair and a perpetually smug expression. Carlyle gestured for Oliver to sit. "Mr. Sloan, Carlyle said, his tone measured and insincere. "How can I help you today?" Oliver didn't sit. Instead, he placed the letter on the table in front of Carlyle. "You can start by explaining this," he said coldly, "and then you can tell me where my barn is." Carlyle glanced at the letter, his expression unreadable. "Ah, yes, the removal of your structure. That decision was made in accordance with HOA guidelines." "What guidelines?" Oliver shot back. "I'm not even a member of the HOA. You don't have any authority over my property." Carlyle leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "All properties within the Crestwood community are subject to HOA oversight, regardless of membership status. When we receive complaints about safety hazards, it's our responsibility to address them." "Safety hazards?" Oliver's voice dripped with disbelief. "There was nothing unsafe about that barn. And who filed these supposed complaints?" "I'm afraid that information is confidential," Carlyle said smoothly. "But rest assured, the decision was not made lightly. The structure was deemed a risk to the community." Oliver felt his patience snapping. "A risk to the community. The barn was on my property, nowhere near anyone else's. This is theft, plain and simple." Carlyle raised an eyebrow, feigning calm. "Mr. Sloan, I understand that you're upset, but the matter has already been resolved. The materials were auctioned, and the proceeds went toward covering the cost of removal." "And where's the rest of my property?" Oliver demanded. "Everything inside that barn, tools, antiques, records, where is it?" Carlyle's expression hardened slightly. "The contents were included in the auction. If you'd like to dispute this, I suggest consulting legal counsel." The words hit Oliver like a punch to the gut. He knew there was no point in continuing the conversation. Carlyle was clearly stonewalling him. Without another word, Oliver turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Back in his truck, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. It was obvious that Carlyle and the HOA were hiding something. The smugness in Carlyle's demeanor had been impossible to miss. He wasn't just enforcing rules, he was covering his tracks. Oliver needed to figure out what was really going on, and he needed to do it fast. His first thought was to check public records. If the barn had been auctioned, there had to be a paper trail. He drove straight to the county clerk's office, determined to track down any documents related to the sale. After explaining his situation to a clerk, he was handed a stack of papers to review. As he sifted through the documents, a pattern began to emerge. The auction had been conducted privately, with no public notice or bidding process. The buyer was listed as an LLC with a generic name, one that sounded suspiciously like a shell company. And the price? A fraction of the barn's true value. Oliver felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just bureaucracy, this was a scheme. Someone had targeted his property specifically, and they had used the HOA as a cover to make it happen. But why? And who was behind it? He left the clerk's office with copies of the documents, his resolve hardening. Whoever had taken his barn wasn't going to get away with it. They had underestimated him, thinking he would roll over and accept their lies. But Oliver wasn't the type to back down. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Oliver spent the evening analyzing the documents he had gathered from the county clerk's office, spreading them across his dining table like pieces of a puzzle. Each page only deepened the sense of violation that had been gnawing at him since the barn's disappearance. The private auction, the absurdly low sale price, the buyer's ambiguous LLC, it was all too convenient. It reeked of a coordinated scam. As he scrutinized the papers, one name stood out repeatedly: Gideon Ford. The LLC listed as the purchaser of his barn was registered to him, a name Oliver had never heard before. Something about it didn't sit right. Determined to dig deeper, Oliver began searching online for information about Gideon Ford. It didn't take long to discover that Ford was a known figure in local real estate circles, a developer with a reputation for shady practices. Articles described his involvement in numerous flips of undervalued properties, many of which had been acquired under questionable circumstances. There were whispers of lawsuits, bribery, and even connections to HOA boards. The pieces began to click into place. Gideon Ford wasn't just a buyer, he was likely the mastermind behind the scheme to steal Oliver's barn. By the time Oliver shut his laptop, it was well past midnight. Despite the exhaustion weighing on him, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the events of the past few days, wondering if he had missed something obvious. His mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and questions. Why his barn? Was it because of the antiques inside? Did Ford know about their value? And how deep did this conspiracy go? The next morning, Oliver decided it was time to get some answers. If Ford thought he could hide behind a shell company and a rigged auction, he was mistaken. Oliver started by calling a contact he had in the local historical preservation community, a woman named Laura who had helped him source materials during the barn's restoration. Laura was well connected and had a knack for uncovering hidden information. He explained the situation, and she promised to look into Ford's dealings. While waiting for Laura to get back to him, Oliver decided to revisit the site where the barn had stood. He hadn't had a chance to thoroughly inspect the area, and something told him there might be more clues to find. When he arrived, the scene was just as unsettling as before. A flat patch of dirt where the barn once proudly stood, now eerily empty. He crouched down to examine the tire tracks again, tracing their path as they led toward the tree line at the edge of his property. The tracks were faint in some places, but they eventually merged with a more defined trail. Oliver followed it, moving deeper into the woods, the air growing cooler and quieter with every step. After about 20 minutes, the trail abruptly ended at a narrow gravel road. Standing there, Oliver realized that whoever had taken the barn must have loaded it onto a large truck and used this road to haul it away. But where did the road lead? He pulled out his phone and opened a map app, marking the location for future reference. This was another breadcrumb in the trail, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As Oliver walked back toward his house, his phone buzzed. It was Laura. "I did some digging," she said, her tone serious. "You're not going to like what I found." "Try me," Oliver replied, bracing himself. Gideon Ford has been tied to several cases where structures were mysteriously removed or demolished after being labeled as hazardous by HOAs, Laura explained. In most of these cases, the homeowners didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. And here's the kicker: Ford is rumored to have financial ties to multiple HOA boards in the region. He's essentially using them as a tool to acquire properties and assets for pennies on the dollar. Oliver felt his anger boiling over. "So he's running a racket," he said through clenched teeth. "Exactly," Laura confirmed. "He gets the HOAs to fabricate violations, then swoops in to solve the problem. It's all legal on paper, but it's as dirty as it gets. And from what I can tell, your HOA is one of his favorite hunting grounds." Oliver thanked her for the information and hung up, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him. Ford and the HOA were exploiting an entire community, and they were getting away with it because most people either didn't have the resources to fight back or didn't even realize they were being targeted. But Oliver wasn't most people. He wasn't going to let Ford profit from his barn or anything else. He decided to confront Ford directly. It was a risky move, but Oliver needed to see the man face to face, to gauge his reaction, and, hopefully, get some answers. Using the address registered to Ford's LLC, Oliver drove to a sleek office building in the heart of downtown. The lobby was all glass and chrome, a sharp contrast to the earthy, grounded life Oliver had built for himself. When he asked the receptionist to see Ford, she hesitated, her polished smile faltering. "Mr. Ford doesn't take unscheduled appointments," she said. Oliver leaned in slightly, his tone firm but calm. "Tell him it's about the barn he just bought from Crestwood HOA. He'll want to see me." The receptionist's eyes flickered with recognition, but she recovered quickly. "One moment." She picked up the phone, murmured something Oliver couldn't make out, and then hung up. "Mr. Ford can see you now," she said, gesturing toward a set of frosted glass doors. Oliver walked through the doors and into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Behind a massive desk sat Gideon Ford, a man in his early 40s with sharp features and an air of practiced charm. He stood and extended a hand, his smile as smooth as the marble floors. "Mr. Sloan," Ford said, "I've heard a lot about you. Please have a seat." Oliver ignored the handshake and remained standing. "I'm not here to make small talk," he said. "I want to know why my barn was stolen." Ford's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. I purchased that barn through a perfectly legal auction. If you have an issue, You'll need to take it up with the HOA. Cut the crap, Oliver snapped. I've seen the documents. I know how you operate. You're using the HOA to run a scam, and you targeted my property because you thought I wouldn't fight back. Well, you thought wrong? Ford leaned back in his chair, his demeanor shifting from cordial to calculating. Mr. Sloan, I assure you, everything I've done is above board. If you want to accuse me of something, you'd better have evidence to back it up. I'm working on that, Oliver said. And when I have it, you'll regret ever setting foot near my property. Ford's smile returned, colder this time. You're welcome to try. But I'd be careful if I were you. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Oliver felt a chill run down his spine at the implied threat, but he didn't let it show. We'll see about that, he said, turning on his heel and walking out of the office. As he stepped back into the sunlight, Oliver's determination solidified. Ford had just made one thing clear: this wasn't going to be easy. But Oliver didn't care. He wasn't just fighting for his barn anymore. He was fighting to bring down an entire corrupt system, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Oliver sat in his truck outside Gideon Ford's sleek office building, gripping the steering wheel as his mind raced. The encounter with Ford had only confirmed what he already knew. This man was not just a shady opportunist, but the orchestrator of a calculated scheme to exploit people like Oliver. Ford's cold smirk, the veiled threat in his words, it was all designed to intimidate. But intimidation wasn't going to work. If Ford thought Oliver would back down, he was dead wrong. What Ford hadn't anticipated was that Oliver was willing to do whatever it took to get to the truth. Returning home, Oliver immediately set to work. He started by analyzing everything he'd learned so far. The fake auction, the HOA's involvement, Ford's ties to other suspicious property seizures, it all pointed to a well-organized operation. But what nagged at Oliver was the timeline. How had the decision to label his barn unsafe been pushed through so quickly? Why hadn't he received any warnings or inspections beforehand? Someone had fast-tracked this entire process, which meant there had to be more than just bureaucracy at play. Someone had targeted him deliberately, and Oliver intended to find out who. His first call was to Laura, the historian who had been digging into Ford's background. She picked up almost immediately, her voice tinged with urgency. "Oliver, I've been looking into some of the HOA records," she said, "and you're not going to believe this. The decision to remove your barn wasn't made by the full HOA board. It was authorized by one person, Richard Carlisle." Oliver felt a surge of anger. Carlisle, the smug HOA president, was directly responsible for greenlighting the theft of his barn. Of course it was Carlisle, Oliver muttered. He's been covering for Ford this whole time. "There's more," Laura continued. "Carlisle has a history of pushing through questionable rulings, but usually for smaller fines or minor violations. Your case is different. It's one of the largest asset seizures they've ever executed. It's almost like someone pressured him to make it happen quickly." Oliver's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you think Carlisle is working directly with Ford?" "It's possible," Laura said, "but I think Carlisle is more of a pawn. Ford is the one pulling the strings. He's the one who stands to gain the most from this." Oliver thanked her and hung up, his mind already formulating his next steps. If Carlisle was the weak link in this chain, Oliver needed to exploit that. He decided to confront Carlisle again, but this time he wouldn't play by the rules. He needed leverage, something that would force Carlisle to talk. The thought of breaking into Carlisle's office crossed his mind, but Oliver quickly dismissed it. He wasn't going to stoop to their level. Instead, he would find a way to expose Carlisle's role in the scheme. Over the next few days, Oliver began watching Carlisle's movements. The HOA president was a creature of habit, sticking to a predictable routine. He spent most of his time at the HOA office, but every Thursday evening, he held a private meeting at his house with a small group of board members. Oliver suspected these meetings were where the real decisions were made, the ones that never made it into the official minutes. If Carlisle was hiding something, this would be the place to find it. That Thursday, Oliver parked a block away from Carlisle's house and approached on foot. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. As he neared the house, he saw several cars parked in the driveway, their headlights still warm from the drive over. Oliver slipped into the shadows of a hedge across the street, carefully observing the scene. Through the large front window, he could see Carlyle and 3 other men seated around a dining table, their faces serious as they spoke in hushed tones. Oliver couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. The mere fact that Carlyle was holding secret meetings with board members was suspicious enough. He snapped a few photos with his phone, careful to keep the flash off. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He would need more concrete evidence to tie Carlyle's to Ford's operation. The opportunity came sooner than Oliver expected. The next morning, as he was reviewing his notes, Laura called him again. "Oliver, you're not going to believe this," she said breathlessly. "I found something in the county records. There's a series of financial transfers between the Crestwood HOA and one of Ford's shell companies. It looks like Carlyle has been funneling money to Ford under the guise of community improvement projects." Oliver's pulse quickened. "How did you find this?" "It wasn't easy," Laura admitted. "The records were buried under a bunch of unrelated filings, but it's all there in black and white. Carlyle's was laundering money through the HOA to fund Ford's acquisitions." This was the breakthrough Oliver had been waiting for. With this evidence, he could not only take down Carlyle but also expose Ford's entire operation. But he knew it wouldn't be enough to hand the documents over to the authorities. People like Carlyle and Ford were experts at covering their tracks. Oliver needed to catch them in the act. That evening, Oliver decided to confront Carlyle one last time. Armed with the financial records Laura had uncovered, he drove to the HOA office just as it was closing. Carlyle was alone, locking up for the night when Oliver approached him. "Carlyle," Oliver called out, his voice firm. The older man turned, his expression wary. "Mr. Sloan," Carlyle said, his tone dripping with forced politeness. "What can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining this," Oliver said, holding up the financial records. "Care to tell me why the HOA is sending money to one of Ford's shell companies?" Carlyle's face blanched, but he quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight. "Those records are confidential." "Not anymore," Oliver shot back. "I have copies and I'm not the only one. This isn't just about my barn, Carlyle. You've been running a scam, using the HOA to steal from homeowners and line Ford's pockets." Carlyle's composure cracked, and for a moment, Oliver saw the fear in his eyes. "You have no idea what you're getting into," Carlyle said, his voice low. "This isn't just about me. There are people involved in this who won't hesitate to make your life miserable." Oliver took a step closer, his voice cold. "Let them try. I'm not backing down, and when this all comes crashing down, you'll be the first to fall." Carlyle stared at him, his jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Without another word, Oliver turned and walked away, his heart pounding. He had rattled Carlyle, but he knew the fight was far from over. If anything, Carlyle's warning only confirmed what Oliver already suspected: this scheme went deeper than he had imagined. As Oliver drove home, he began planning his next move. He would take the evidence to a lawyer, someone who could help him build a case against Ford and Carlyle. But he also knew he needed to prepare for the fallout. People like Ford didn't go down without a fight, and Oliver was about to step into the lion's den. The battle was just beginning, but Oliver felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his barn anymore, it was about standing up to corruption and exposing the truth. No matter how long it took or how hard the fight became, he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Oliver returned home with his mind sharper than ever. The confrontation with Carlyle had confirmed one thing. This wasn't just a local HOA dispute spiraling out of control. Carlyle's pale face and his barely veiled threat spoke volumes. This was a well-oiled machine designed to exploit people, and Oliver had just kicked the hornet's nest. But if they thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were sorely mistaken. He knew he was playing a dangerous game now, but the stakes were too high to back down. His barn wasn't just about property, it was a line in the sand. The next morning, Oliver received a rude awakening. A loud knock echoed through the house, pulling him from a restless sleep. He opened the door to find 2 uniformed HOA representatives standing stiffly on his porch. One of them, a younger man with a clipboard, greeted him with an overly professional tone. "Mr. Sloan, We're here to inform you that a formal complaint has been filed against your property." Oliver frowned. "A complaint? For what?" The man glanced at his clipboard, though the gesture seemed more for show. "Your property has been cited for failing to meet community standards, including unapproved structures, overgrown vegetation, and unauthorized modifications to the exterior of your home." Oliver's blood boiled. "That's complete nonsense," he snapped. "First, you have no jurisdiction over my property. Second, these so-called violations are made up." The second representative, an older woman with a pinched expression, cut in. "Mr. Sloan, we're simply here to inform you of the complaint. Any disputes can be handled through the proper channels." "I'll handle it. All right," Oliver said through gritted teeth. "Now get off my property." As the two representatives walked back to their car, Oliver noticed the subtle smirks they exchanged. This wasn't about enforcing any rules, it was retaliation, plain and simple. They were trying to distract him, wear him down with fabricated charges while their real operation continued unchecked. Oliver refused to let them derail him. He spent the day documenting his property with photographs and detailed notes, creating a record that would disprove their baseless accusations. But he knew this was just the beginning. The HOA was escalating, and he had to stay ahead of them. That evening, Oliver received a call from Laura. "Oliver, I've got more bad news," she said, her voice tense. "I've been digging into Gideon Ford's connections, and it's worse than we thought. He's tied to a network of developers who specialize in flipping seized properties, and it looks like your barn wasn't the first structure they've targeted. I found a similar case from 2 years ago. The owner tried to fight back, but they were hit with so many fines and legal threats that they eventually gave up and sold their property to one of Ford's companies." Oliver's jaw tightened. "They're trying to push me into a corner," he said. "But I'm not giving up. If they want to fight, I'll give them one." Laura hesitated before responding. "Just be careful, Oliver. These people don't play fair." "I know," Oliver said, "but neither do I." The next few days brought more signs that the HOA and Ford were stepping up their efforts. Oliver noticed unfamiliar cars parked on his street, their occupants watching his house from a distance. At night, his motion sensor lights flickered on and off as if someone was deliberately triggering them. And then there was the note he found taped to his front door, written in neat, anonymous handwriting, "Drop it, or you'll regret it." Oliver wasn't scared, but he was angry. He installed additional security cameras around his property, making sure every corner was covered. If they wanted to intimidate him, he would give them something to think about. The breaking point came when Oliver discovered that someone had tampered with his truck. He was heading out early one morning to meet with a lawyer when he noticed the unmistakable sign scratches on the lock, wires hanging loosely from underneath the hood. Someone had tried to disable his vehicle. They hadn't succeeded, but the message was clear. They wanted him immobile. Instead of backing down, Oliver decided to go on the offensive. He started by filing a formal police report about the attempted sabotage, as well as the threatening note. It might not amount to much on its own, but it created a paper trail. From there, he turned his attention to Carlisle. Using the financial records Laura had uncovered, Oliver crafted a detailed report connecting Carlisle's to Ford's shady dealings. He included evidence of the shell companies, the private auctions, and the money being funneled through the HOA. Armed with this information, Oliver reached out to a local journalist known for exposing corruption. The journalist, an older man named Frank Meyer, listened intently as Oliver laid out his case. "This is big," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. "If we can verify all of this, it's going to make waves. But you need to be ready for what comes next. These kinds of stories have a way of ruffling feathers." "I'm ready," Oliver said. "I just want the truth out there." Over the next week, Frank began investigating Carlisle and Ford, corroborating Oliver's evidence with his own sources. Meanwhile, Oliver kept the pressure on. He attended an HOA board meeting unannounced, walking into the room with the confidence of a man who had nothing to lose. The room fell silent as he strode to the front and addressed the board. "I know what you're doing," Oliver said, his voice steady and firm. "And I'm not going to let you get away with it." Carlisle's face turned red, but he quickly composed himself. "Mr. Sloan, this is highly inappropriate. If you have concerns, you can submit them through the proper channels." "The proper channels?" Oliver shot back. You mean the ones you've rigged to serve Ford's interests? I've seen the financial records. I know about the shell companies, the fake auctions, the money you're funneling into Ford's pocket. And I'm not the only one. The press knows too. A murmur rippled through the room. Carlyle's mask of composure cracked as he stammered a response. These are baseless accusations. If you continue to slander this board, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action. Go ahead, Oliver said, leaning forward, because I have the receipts, and I'm not afraid to use them. The tension in the room was palpable as Oliver turned and walked out, leaving Carlyle and the board scrambling to contain the fallout. That night, Oliver received a call from Frank. We're publishing the story tomorrow, Frank said. But I've heard rumblings that Ford's people are gearing up for damage control. You need to watch your back. I will, Oliver promised. As he hung up the phone, Oliver felt a sense of resolve wash over him. The HOA and Ford might have the resources to fight back, but they had underestimated him. This was no longer just about his barn. It was about standing up to a corrupt system that preyed on the powerless. And Oliver wasn't going to stop until he brought it crashing down. The morning the story broke, Oliver woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. Texts, calls, and notifications flooded in all at once. Frank Meyer's article had gone live, and it was damning. The piece meticulously laid out the web of corruption connecting Gideon Ford, Richard Carlyle, and the HOA. It detailed the shell companies, the private auctions, and the underhanded tactics used to steal property under the guise of community improvement. Photos of Oliver's barn and excerpts from the financial documents added a visceral edge to the expose, making it impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, the fallout had begun. Neighbors who had been skeptical of Oliver suddenly started calling to offer support. Many admitted that they, too, had received fines or notices that seemed suspiciously targeted. One woman tearfully confessed that her husband had sold their backyard workshop years ago after the HOA pressured them into believing it was non-compliant. Oliver listened, anger simmering beneath his surface as the pattern of exploitation became clearer with each story. But he didn't have time to dwell on the public reaction. He knew that exposing the scheme was only the first step. Carlyle and Ford were cornered now, and desperate men were dangerous. Sure enough, it didn't take long for them to retaliate. That afternoon, Oliver received a letter from a high-powered law firm representing both the HOA and Gideon Ford. The letter accused him of defamation, demanded a retraction of the claims published in the article, and threatened a lawsuit if he didn't comply within 48 hours. Oliver tossed the letter onto his kitchen counter, unfazed. He had expected this move, and Frank had assured him the evidence they'd published was airtight. Let them come for him, Oliver thought. They were grasping at straws, and he wasn't about to back down. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. People like Ford didn't rely solely on lawyers when their empire was at risk. That night, his instincts were proven right. Around 2 a.m., Oliver was jolted awake by the sound of his motion sensors blaring. He scrambled out of bed and checked the live feed from his security cameras. 3 figures, dressed in dark clothing, were moving around his property. One of them was near the spot where the barn had stood, while the other 2 appeared to be tampering with the cameras near his garage. His heart pounded as he grabbed his phone and called the police. As he waited for the authorities to arrive, Oliver kept an eye on the feed. The intruders moved with precision, their movements coordinated and deliberate. These weren't amateurs. He watched as one of them planted something on the ground near the empty patch of dirt where his barn had been. A chill ran down his spine. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but by then the intruders were gone, disappearing into the woods surrounding Oliver's property. The officers conducted a brief search but found no trace of them. However, they did discover what had been left behind, a bundle of wires attached to what appeared to be an explosive device. Fortunately, it was fake, a crude prop meant to intimidate, but the message was clear: back off. Oliver stood in the cold night air as the officers explained the situation. You've clearly made someone angry, one of them said, his tone laced with concern. This isn't a prank. You need to be careful. Careful wasn't in Oliver's vocabulary anymore. This was an escalation, and he was done playing defense. The next morning, he contacted Laura and Frank, filling them in on what had happened. Frank was furious. "They're trying to scare you into silence," he said. "But this only makes them look worse. I'll update the story with this new development." "No," Oliver said firmly. "Not yet. If they think I'm scared, they'll get sloppy. I want them to make a mistake." Oliver spent the day preparing for the next move. He reviewed every piece of evidence he had, looking for anything he might have missed. One detail caught his attention. A receipt from the fake auction listed a specific storage facility, where the barn's components had been held temporarily before being sold. It was a lead he hadn't followed yet, and it might be his best chance to find something concrete. That evening, Oliver drove to the storage facility. The address led him to a gated complex on the outskirts of town, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. He parked his truck a block away and approached on foot, carrying a small toolkit. Breaking in wasn't his first choice, but he knew he wouldn't get answers by knocking on the front door. Using a set of lockpicks, Oliver bypassed the gate and made his way inside. The facility was quiet, the only sounds coming from the hum of distant machinery. He located the unit number listed on the receipt and was relieved to find the lock was relatively simple. Within minutes, he had the door open. Inside, the unit was packed with crates and pallets, all labeled with codes that didn't mean anything to Oliver at first glance. He began searching through them, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. After several minutes, he found what he was looking for: a stack of wooden planks and beams that had been part of his barn. His breath caught as he spotted a familiar mark on one of the beams, his initials, carved there years ago when he first restored the structure. But that wasn't all. Buried beneath the wood were several boxes filled with files and ledgers. As Oliver flipped through them, his suspicion turned to certainty. These were records of every property Ford had acquired through his scheme: names, addresses, financial details, and even internal memos detailing how the HOA had been manipulated to force homeowners into compliance. It was a goldmine of evidence, enough to not only dismantle Ford's operation but also implicate everyone involved. Oliver loaded as much as he could into his truck and left the storage facility, his heart pounding. He knew he had just crossed a line. If Ford and Carlisle weren't desperate before, they would be now. But for the first time, Oliver felt like he had the upper hand. He wasn't just fighting for his barn anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had been steamrolled by this corrupt system. By the time he got home, the adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a grim determination. He locked the evidence in his workshop and sat down to plan his next move. The fight wasn't over yet, but Oliver was ready. This time he wasn't just defending himself. He was taking the fight to them. The following morning, Oliver woke to the sound of his phone ringing incessantly. It was Frank Meyer, the journalist, and his tone was urgent. "Oliver, we've got a problem," he said. "My source just tipped me off. Ford and Carlisle know you've got the files. They're trying to preemptively discredit you by filing criminal charges. I don't know how they're pulling this off so fast, but you need to be ready." Oliver's stomach dropped, but his resolve didn't waver. "Let them try," he said. "I have enough evidence to bury them." Still, the news pushed Oliver into high gear. He spent the next few hours organizing the documents he had recovered from the storage facility. The ledgers and internal memos were damning, but he needed to ensure the evidence was secure and could withstand scrutiny. He made multiple copies of the files, uploading digital versions to encrypted drives and sending them to trusted allies, including Frank and Laura. Just as Oliver was finishing his preparations, 2 police cars pulled into his driveway. He stepped outside to meet them, his heart pounding but his expression calm. 2 officers approached him, and the lead officer spoke firmly. "Mr. Sloan, we have a warrant to search your property. We've received a report alleging the possession of stolen materials." Oliver crossed his arms, his voice steady. "That's interesting, considering the materials in question were stolen from me, and I have the evidence to prove it." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly uneasy. "We still need to execute the warrant," the lead officer said. "Go ahead," Oliver replied, stepping aside, "but I'll be contacting my lawyer immediately." As the officers searched his property, Oliver watched from a distance, his jaw clenched. He knew this was a desperate move by Ford and Carlisle to scare him into submission. But he also knew it would backfire. The evidence was undeniable, and any attempt to suppress it would only make them look guiltier. By the time the search was over, the officers left empty-handed, their warrant yielding nothing incriminating. Oliver immediately called Frank and updated him on the situation. Frank's response was swift. "This is the leverage we needed," he said. "I'm publishing an update to the story tonight, and I'm including the files you recovered. Once this goes live, there's no coming back for them." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank's updated expose hit the news. It was a bombshell detailing the full scope of Ford and Carlisle's scheme. The files from the storage unit provided irrefutable proof of their corruption, from the manipulated HOA rulings to the financial kickbacks and rigged auctions. The article named names, included receipts, and painted a clear picture of a network built on greed and deceit. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media lit up with outrage, and calls flooded into local government offices demanding action. By morning, state authorities had announced an investigation into Crestwood HOA and Ford's operations. Carlisle resigned from the HOA in disgrace, and Ford went into hiding as the walls closed in around him. For Oliver, the victory was bittersweet. He had reclaimed his barn, at least on paper, and his name had been cleared, but the battle had taken its toll. His property felt more like a battleground than a sanctuary, and he couldn't shake the lingering tension of the past weeks. Determined to move forward, Oliver began restoring the barn once more. It took weeks to transport the salvaged materials back to his property and rebuild what had been torn away. But this time the work felt different. Each beam he placed, each nail he hammered, carried a new sense of purpose. The barn wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing up against injustice no matter the odds. As the final plank was set in place, Oliver stood back and took a deep breath. The barn was whole again, and so was he. His fight had not only protected his home but also exposed a corrupt system that had preyed on countless others. And though he knew the scars of the battle would remain, so would the lessons. Oliver's neighbors began to rally around him, inspired by his determination. They formed a new community council, one built on transparency and fairness, ensuring that no one else would fall victim to the abuses of power that had plagued their neighborhood. On the day the barn restoration was complete, Oliver hosted a gathering for the community. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the freshly rebuilt structure, he looked around at the people who had come together, united by a shared commitment to justice. For the first time in weeks, he felt at peace. The barn stood tall once more, not just as a testament to the past, but as a promise for the future. Oliver had fought, he had endured, and he had won not just for himself, but for everyone who refused to be silenced.